So today we're covering CSS positioning and centering as our programming topic. So first, a few announcements. Homework 3 is due right now. Homework 4 is going to be released tonight and will be due next week on October 5th. We're going to have a Figma lab on Tuesday, the 3rd. Figma is a tool you can use for design and start sketching out some websites. And we released the midterm project. We're gonna have check-ins due by next week on Thursday before lecture. So yeah, we'll give you a little bit more information on that, but check on our Notion to see the actual assignment itself. And yeah, one more reminder that 4 mandatory attendances are required for lecture, so that's in-person attendances, sorry. And you will receive an NP if you don't make 4. So yeah, just make sure to be mindful of that. So yeah, the midterm project has been released on Notion, and the project is to create a website from scratch pertaining to a given theme. What you'll need to do is create a high fidelity mockup by Thursday, October 5th, and get it checked off in a TA's office hours to get 3 points out of that midterm. Otherwise, your maximum score is going to be 19 out of 22. So you don't get any of those points if you don't make it by Thursday. But also don't worry too much because it's 3 points. So don't start coding until you've gotten checked off, just so that we can make sure that your design seems reasonable and you won't struggle too much and you cover most of the design principles we've talked about. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Yeah, Thursday, October 5th is going to be the first deadline for that. Okay, so now going into the content for today, let's first remember our HTML skeleton. So if you can see how we've kind of structured this, if anyone can give me some of the tags that are in here, just based on what you can remember from what we've covered in HTML. Maybe how do we make our text look bigger? What kind of tag can we put? Yeah. Yeah. So probably this Berkeley Food Guide one is our H1 tag. Anyone else got any thoughts on any of these? Yeah. Yeah, that's also probably true. Yeah, the bolded text here in the headings is probably because of some strong. Any other ideas? Yeah, cool. Another one that I noticed, you might be familiar with the kind of blue link style thing from very old websites, but this is usually denoting like an A tag or like a link. So that might be one that you noticed. Yeah, but yeah, great job. Yeah, it's important to think of these divs, the kind of boxes that we have around everything, as containers in parent-child connections. So for example, in this diagram, we have one big div. We have the body containing everything, and then the child of that is the div, and the child of that is the header, and the child of that is the H1, and so on. So we have this huge nested relationship, which you guys have probably noticed when you've been working on your assignments. But when we have this content, we want to position them relative to their containers. So for example, in this diagram, we have the big box that's containing everything, and we want to have these links side by side. We want to have our text up at the top. So it's all relative to the container that they're inside. Does everyone kind of understand where I'm coming from there? Okay, cool. Yeah. So the big deal about divs and boxes is all about positioning. So these boxes we've found over years and years, it's really easy to figure out where they need to go and like how we want to style it. So with these boxes, it becomes really easy to make these these side, like the links side by side, because we just move the boxes next to each other. So when we position things, we're disrupting the normal flow of elements in a page. So normally elements want to just go straight down the page. You might have noticed in the first few assignments that everything is just stacked on top of one another, and there's really no like horizontal motion at all. So today we're going to change that with positioning. So by default, or in HTML, we have, sorry, in CSS, we have 4 different types of positioning that you guys will mainly be using. The first type is static. So this is what you've been used to so far. This is just going normally flowing just straight down the page. There's relative, which positions to the normal flow, but offsets it relative to itself. And the offset does not affect its surrounding elements. So it's completely independently moving. Absolute is the element where we pull this out of the normal flow, and this is positioned relative to its closest position ancestor. So anything, if you have a whole bunch of absolute things inside of each other, they will all be independent of each other. But the first thing that isn't absolute is the thing that we're going to anchor everything to, if that makes sense. But we'll go through that, so don't worry. And the last one is fixed. Again, we pull it out of the normal flow and we position it relative to the screen. So for example, you might notice that this like zoom control is fixed to the screen. If I scroll on any page, the zoom is not going to move. So yeah, that's an example of like a fixed element. So first, let's go through default positioning. Default positioning is just moving in what we call the normal flow. And this is what you guys are used to in terms of A is on top of B is on top of C, and you keep going down. There's no changes in anything. But now we can introduce position relative. Position relative is positioning the element according to the normal flow. So put it where it's supposed to be, and then move it a little bit relative to itself. And I'll show an example. But this does not affect the surrounding elements, is kind of the important part of this. Like if we move one down, not everything's going to move. It's just that one that's going to move. And this is what that looks like. So we have A, B, and C. They're stacked normally, and then we set B to have this position relative, and then it's top 20 pixels and left 30 pixels. So it's moved over to the bottom right. And I'll explain why it's the bottom right, but yeah, go with me for now. Does anyone have questions on like how we got here? Yeah. Yeah, so we're pushing it. We'll explain a little bit more, but there's 20 pixels of space on the top, and then there's 30 pixels of space on the left. Yeah, from where it usually would be, correct. Cool. So here's kind of where we're looking. Where those lines are where the top is usually at and where the left is usually at. And you can see that it's moved 20 pixels from the top and 30 pixels from the left. So an important thing to notice is that it's kind of backwards of what you would think, but you've got to just kind of think of it a little bit different. Cool. So here's another example. So we have the same situation. A and C are not changed at all, but B is given a position relative with left 50 pixels and bottom 20 pixels. So as you can see, it moved to the right and up. I hope that makes sense. If there's any questions, please let me know. Cool. All right, so again, we have a few arrows to kind of show you what's happening. And we have it moving to the right 50 pixels, and we have it moving up 20 pixels. Cool. So that's all that we're covering for position relative. Next, we're going to cover position absolute. So position absolute is saying that we pull it out of this normal flow, the stacked A, B, and C, and instead we're giving it a position relative to its closest relatively positioned ancestor, which is a really complicated way of saying everything that isn't itself absolute. So we have this huge container around everything, the gray box here, and that is containing A, B, and C, but we set B to have position absolute, and it's put in at the right at 0 pixels and top at 0 pixels as well. And you might notice that instead of just like leaving an empty space, C actually moved up to where B was before. Does anyone have questions on how that happened? Yeah. So we would probably do that relatively. So just move it a little bit up would be probably relative positioning. Absolute is if we want to just put it at a specific spot. Like we have the pixel numbers and we want to put it at some specific like coordinate basically. That's when we want to use absolute. Yeah. So I'll explain a little bit more of this, but the right edge is being put at 0 pixels away from the right side, if that makes sense. So it's in a container, and that container's right edge is actually this slide. So like this would be the right edge, and it's being put 0 pixels away from that edge. And then the top, the same thing. So this is the top of the container it's in, and we put it 0 pixels from that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, great. So what happened? Why did things seem to break and go out of their container? It's because we don't have div class, the container one positioned. So when we have content, we want it to be positioned relative to their containers. And this container now is relative. And so when that becomes relative, then we align it. So this is more of what you might think would happen. Before, the main container of the screen was our container, but now we have this inner, sorry to use container so much, but this inner container that is now keeping us inside of the box. So what if we wanted to put things on top of each other? So we have this container on our right side, and that's position relative. And then we have 3 elements that are position absolute, that are all inside of that container. So what that means is that all of them are going to be positioned relative to their container. So let's take a look at A. A, B, and C all go into the same spot because none of them are going according to the normal flow. Does that kind of make sense? Cool. So yeah, when we set everything absolute, then nothing's happening. We're just setting it where it is and not doing any sort of stacking. So as you might see, we have everything at 0, 0, basically, of this bigger container. So you might want to think of relatively positioned ancestors as the origin point for absolute positioning. So if we do nothing but set them to be position absolute, they'll just sit in the top left corner of whatever container they're in. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, cool. So we have this screen. This is from Airbnb. Does anyone know what here might be absolutely positioned and what might be relatively positioned? Okay, so let's walk through it then. So we have our relatively positioned container, which is just this whole screen. And then we use absolute positioning to put the sign up form on the left side, kind of just at a random point. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, cool. So it would be pretty hard to do this relatively because like we don't want to mess up all the other stuff, but we still want it at this very specific spot. So the best way to do it is just pull it out of that normal flow and put it at exactly where we want it. Cool, does that make sense? Great. So next we're gonna cover position fixed. Position fixed is pulling stuff out of the normal flow and positioning it relative to the window or the viewport as we call it. And so let's take a look at an example of this. So we have our normal 3 elements. They're positioned relative, so they're doing the normal stacking thing, but we also have this .nav, and this nav is being fixed to the top of the screen. So we set it to left 0 pixels and top 0 pixels, and it's position fixed, so it goes to wherever the screen borders are. In this case, the screen is the slide. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool, okay. So yeah, this blue bar is fixed to the window. Does anyone have any ideas on what might be the fixed element here? This is from our website. Yeah, so that top bar, the red bar at the top, is gonna be position fixed because we want it to stay on your screen even if you keep scrolling. Let me see if I can pull up our current website to see if we can show you. So in our current website, you have this orange bar and it doesn't go away even if we keep scrolling, which is not what you would normally think would happen. Everything else is kind of going according to this normal flow, but this one element is being stuck to the top of our browser. Does that make sense how fixed looks? Cool, okay. So now let's move on to centering. So centering is something you might want to do just to get everyone's eyes in the middle of the page. It makes it look a little bit better and helps with readability. So how do we center things? Horizontally centering block elements can be done by doing margin right auto and margin left auto. So what that's saying is just put enough space on both sides of me to put me in the center. Yeah. If you just put margin left auto, for example, it'll just push it to the right side. But because we set both of them to be auto, like the computer knows that auto means to just balance everything out. And so left and right combined puts us in the middle. Yeah. I think margin auto would also work, but it might affect some vertical stuff as well. So if you were just trying to get the horizontal centered, the best way is margin right auto and margin left auto, but we'll see if maybe margin auto would help with centering in the direct middle. Any other questions about that? Great questions, by the way. So as you were saying, margin with two properties means we're defining the vertical centering and the horizontal centering second. So we can just do margin 0 auto instead. 0 is for vertical. So margin top and bottom are going to be 0, but our margin horizontal left and right is going to be auto. Yeah. It would only change the vertical direction, yeah. And we'll talk about that. Anyone else have questions about that? Cool. So now let's talk about vertically centering with absolute position. So we have this big potato with a width of 100 pixels and a height of 50 pixels. And in order to center it in the screen, we might try to put top at 50% in an absolute positioning. So what top at 50% is saying is move the top border to 50% of the screen down, or 50% of that container down. So this doesn't look exactly right. We're aligned to the center, but we're not actually centered. So the way that we might want to do that is by doing this. So transform and then translate Y up 50 pixels. So what transform does is it's taking in its own height. So translate Y is talking about 50% of the potato's height, not the container's height. So we moved from right below the line to halfway through the line. Does everyone get that? That's a little bit confusing. Okay. So this is with absolute positioning, and we can center things too. So put things directly in the center, we can do the same thing. So we have our position absolute with top 50% and left 50%. So that's moving us down, aligned with the middle on the horizontal axis, and then aligned with the middle on the vertical axis. But we also have this translate. So now it's not specifying a specific X or Y, we're just translating both. And we're translating both up and to the left by 50% of our object size. So 50% of our potato's width and 50% of our potato's height is being shifted. Yeah. So that's how you center things in HTML. So let's talk about a few miscellaneous things. You might have noticed that when we worked with relative positioning and absolute positioning, things were getting layered on top of each other, and maybe we want something to be on top of everything and something to be behind everything. So the way that we can define that is by doing z-index. So we have this situation where we have A and B was moved a little bit, so now they're overlapping. But we want A to be on top of B instead of B on top of A. So we can add these z-indexes, and basically what the z-index is saying is that whichever has the higher z-index goes on top, and whichever has the lower z-index goes on the bottom. Any questions on that? Cool. So any questions overall on how we do positioning in CSS? Everyone understands relative, absolute, how we normally do it, and fixed? Cool. All right. Then we'll move on to our design portion today.